When the elevator finally reached the lobby, Brian and Grace stepped out, keeping a low profile as they navigated toward the exit. The usually bustling hotel was quiet at this late hour, with only a few guests lingering near the front desk. But even in the stillness, Brian felt a prickling awareness, as though unseen eyes followed their every step. They stepped into the crisp night air, the glow of city lights reflecting off the pavement. Brian immediately pulled out his phone, typing a message to Marvin with shaky fingers. "We need to meet, it's urgent. I'm outside the hotel." Grace stood beside him, her arms tightly crossed, her gaze darting up to the illuminated windows of Henry Plaza. "Do you think Mateo knows we were listening?" she asked, her voice hushed but tense. Brian shook his head, though doubt lingered in his expression. "I don't think so, but we can't afford to assume anything." Minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Marvin stepped out, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a taut expression of concern. As he approached, his voice was low but firm. "What's going on?" Marvin asked, his eyes darting between Brian and Grace. Brian wasted no time diving into the details. Mateo's secret meeting, the planned financial transfer that would strip the hotel of its resources, and the looming threat of financial collapse. His words came in a rush, each revelation more damning than the last. Marvin's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information. The gravity of the situation etched deep lines into his face. "This is worse than I imagined," Marvin said, his tone grim. "I knew Mateo was crooked, but this, siphoning funds to leave the hotel in ruins, it's beyond what I expected." Brian nodded, his own urgency reflected in his voice. "We have to act now. If they move those funds, there will be nothing left to save. We need to freeze the accounts before it's too late." Marvin's expression hardened with resolve. "I'll convene an emergency board meeting immediately," he said. "We'll lock the accounts and stop this transfer. Mateo won't get his hands on another dollar." Relief washed over Brian, though the tension in his chest didn't fully ease. They had taken a critical step, but Mateo was still out there, and he wouldn't go down quietly. Grace's wary glance back at the hotel mirrored Brian's thoughts. The battle wasn't over yet. Brian Henry felt a brief surge of relief, but it was fleeting. Freezing the accounts might stop the financial transfer, but Mateo was still a formidable threat. The man wouldn't go down quietly, and Brian knew this wasn't the end. "What about Mateo's partner?" Grace asked, her tone laced with tension. "We still don't know who they are." Marvin frowned, his face dark with thought. "I've been digging, but I haven't uncovered anything yet. Whoever they are, they're keeping themselves well hidden." Zing blared a bark, followed by a command, and frustration flared in Brian's chest, his fists tightening at his sides. They were so close to dismantling Mateo's scheme, but the elusive partner remained a mystery, an unseen force, orchestrating chaos from the shadows. "We'll figure it out," Marvin said, his voice resolute. "For now, our priority is stopping Mateo. Once the accounts are frozen, he'll have no escape." Brian nodded, but a deep unease gnawed at him. Mateo wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. He was cunning, ruthless, and unpredictable. There was no telling what he might do when he realized his plan had unraveled. "We need to stay vigilant," Brian said quietly. "Mateo isn't the type to back down. He'll fight until the end." Marvin met Brian's gaze, his expression steady and determined. "Then we'll be ready for him." Grace glanced between them, worry flickering in her eyes. If we don't figure out who the partner is soon, they could still find a way to salvage this. Mateo might be desperate, but he's not working alone. Brian felt the weight of her words settle over him. She was right. Mateo's partner was an unknown variable, and until they uncovered their identity, the danger wouldn't truly be over. Brian Henry arrived at Henry Plaza early that morning, his nerves coiled tight like a spring. The emergency board meeting called by Marvin had likely already frozen the hotel's accounts, effectively dismantling Mateo's scheme to siphon funds. But Brian knew all too well that Mateo wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The battle was far from over. As Brian moved through the lobby, he could feel the tension thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. Staff hurried from task to task, their expressions tense, their movements sharp with unease. The usual lively hum of the hotel had been replaced by an unsettling quiet, the kind that made every creak and whisper seem amplified. In the staff break room, Brian found Grace pacing nervously, her arms crossed tightly. She looked up as he entered, her face mirroring the apprehension he felt. "Have you heard anything?" Brian asked, his voice low. Grace shook her head, her brow furrowed. "No, but everyone's on edge. Mateo hasn't shown up yet. People are starting to talk." Brian frowned, his mind whirring. Mateo was never late. His absence was a glaring anomaly, one that sent a chill down Brian's spine. "We need to stay alert," Brian said, his tone resolute. "Mateo knows his plan didn't work. He's going to try something else. We can't let him blindside us." Grace nodded, though the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "What do you think he's planning?" "I don't know," Brian admitted, the uncertainty weighing heavily on him. "But whatever it is, we need to be ready for it." As the hours ticked by, the sense of unease in the hotel only deepened. Staff whispered in hushed tones, casting wary glances toward the elevators and the front desk. Even the guests seemed to sense that something was off, their cheerful conversations dampened by the heavy atmosphere. Then, just before noon, Brian saw him. Mateo stepped out of a sleek black car parked at the hotel's front entrance. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes hard and calculating as he strode toward the entrance. There was no mistaking it, Mateo knew his scheme had failed. Yet there was something in his expression that sent a shiver through Brian. It wasn't just anger. It was something far more dangerous. Brian tracked Mateo with his gaze as the man entered the lobby, his commanding presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Mateo didn't hesitate, heading straight for his office at the back of the hotel. The door closed behind him with a quiet but resolute click. Brian exhaled slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever Mateo was planning, Brian could feel it coming, like the ominous rumble of thunder before the storm. Brian Henry sat at a small table in the staff break room at Henry Plaza, his thoughts spiraling as he considered the situation. The hotel's accounts had been frozen, effectively stopping Mateo's scheme to embezzle funds. But Brian knew this wasn't the end of it. Mateo wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat. He was cunning and ruthless. Across the table, Grace sat with her arms crossed, her expression drawn with tension. She had barely spoken since hearing the news about the board's intervention. Brian could sense the unease radiating from her, mirroring his own apprehension. This small victory felt hollow, like a fleeting calm before an inevitable storm. "He's not going to give up," Grace said quietly, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but tinged with worry. "Mateo's too invested in this. He won't just walk away without a fight." Brian nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. That's why we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Grace leaned forward, her tone urgent but hushed. "But how? We've stopped him from taking the money, but he still has control here. Judy's still his enforcer, and she's watching everyone like a hawk. If we slip up even once..." Brian ran a hand through his hair, the weight of their predicament pressing down on him. Freezing the accounts had been a crucial step, but Mateo still had significant leverage. His influence over the staff remained intact, and with Judy backing him, he still held power in the day-to-day operations of the hotel. Mateo was far from defeated, and Brian knew that if the man decided to strike back, the consequences could be catastrophic. "We need to expose him completely," Brian said, his voice calm but resolute. "Freezing the accounts bought us time, but it's not enough. We have to make sure everyone, staff, the board, even the guests, sees him for who he really is." Grace met his gaze, the determination in his voice sparking a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You're right. she said, nodding slowly. If we can shine a light on what he's done, he won't have anywhere to hide. Brian leaned back in his chair, the pieces of a plan beginning to form in his mind. It won't be easy, he said. Mateo's been covering his tracks for years, but if we can find the right evidence, the kind that leaves no room for doubt, we can finally bring him down. Grace exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Then we need to act fast, she said. Mateo's not going to sit back and wait for us to outmaneuver him. If we're going to take him down, we have to stay one step ahead. Brian nodded, a steely resolve settling over him. Mateo had built his empire on lies and fear, but Brian wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. Together, he and Grace would find the truth, expose Mateo's corruption, and save Henry Plaza from the man who had nearly destroyed it. Brian Henry's voice was steady as he spoke, determination etched into every word. Completely, he said at last. The board already has the financial proof, but that's just the surface. They don't see the whole picture, how Mateo has manipulated and intimidated the staff into silence. If we can show them the full extent of what he's done, they won't just freeze the accounts. They'll fire him. Grace looked at Brian, a mix of fear and hope flickering in her wide eyes. But how do we prove it? She asked, her voice tinged with doubt. The staff is terrified of him, and Judy will cover for him like she always does. Brian sat back, deep in thought. He knew they were on borrowed time. With the accounts frozen, Mateo would undoubtedly be plotting his next move. If they didn't act quickly, he might find a way to regain control or deflect suspicion. There's only one way, Brian said quietly, a plan beginning to take shape in his mind. We have to record him. If we can catch Mateo threatening someone or openly discussing his schemes, we'll have undeniable evidence. Grace's face paled, her eyes widening in alarm. Record him. Brian, that's dangerous. If he finds out... It won't, Brian said firmly. We'll be careful, Grace, but this is our only shot to bring him down once and for all. Grace hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her expression. I'll help, but we need to be smart about this. Brian gave her a faint smile, gratitude and determination mingling in his gaze. We will be. The day passed in a blur of cautious glances and tense moments. Brian and Grace went through their usual routines, blending in with the other employees as best they could. Still, the weight of their plan loomed over them. Mateo hadn't made a move since the accounts had been frozen, but Brian knew the man was too calculating to stay silent for long. By the time his shift ended, Brian's plan was fully formed. Mateo wouldn't act recklessly, not yet. He was too meticulous to risk a public outburst. Instead, he would likely meet with Judy or one of his other allies, strategizing his next steps. And when he did, Brian would be ready. That evening, when the lobby had quieted and most of the guests had retired to their rooms, Brian met Grace in the break room. The tension in the air was palpable. Both had changed out of their uniforms, opting for casual clothes that would help them blend in. Grace held a small voice recorder in her hand, her expression serious. Are you absolutely sure this is going to work? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Brian nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. It has to, he said simply. We'll stay hidden and make sure we're not seen. If Mateo says anything incriminating, it'll be all we need. Grace hesitated for a moment, then nodded, the resolve in her expression matching his. Together, they left the break room and made their way to the service elevators at the back of the hotel. Their plan was straightforward. Find a hidden spot near Mateo's office, wait for him to meet with Judy or one of his other confidants, and record their conversation. As the elevator doors opened, Brian felt the weight of the risk pressing down on him. Every step brought them closer to the moment of truth. If they succeeded, they could finally expose Mateo for who he truly was. But if they failed, the consequences could be devastating. The service elevator doors slid open, and Brian, Henry, and Grace stepped inside. Tension hung heavy in the air as the elevator began its ascent to the top floor. Brian's mind was laser-focused, replaying every step of their plan. There was no room for error. One mistake could unravel everything they had worked for. When the elevator chimed softly and the doors parted, Brian led Grace into the hushed hallway. The dim lighting cast long shadows, and the plush carpet muted their footsteps as they navigated the corridor toward Mateo's office. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. They reached a corner near the office, slipping behind a large potted plant. It wasn't much cover, but it was enough to keep them out of sight, while staying within earshot. Brian's heartbeat thundered in his chest, the tension almost unbearable. Grace clutched the voice recorder tightly, her knuckles white. The silence was oppressive, every distant noise amplified as they waited. Minutes crawled by, each one dragging slower than the last. Just as doubt began to creep in, a soft click broke the quiet. The sound of a door opening. Brian stilled, holding his breath. Footsteps echoed softly against the hallway walls, two distinct sets. One was heavy and purposeful, a cadence Brian instantly recognized as Mateo's. The other was lighter, more deliberate. It could only be Judy. They stopped just outside Mateo's office, their voices low but carrying enough for Brian and Grace to make out their conversation. "I can't believe the board froze the accounts," Mateo growled, his tone laced with fury. "They're moving faster than I anticipated." "They're scared," Judy replied smoothly, her voice calm and composed. "Brian's been stirring the pot, and now the board's jumping at shadows. But they don't know everything yet. We can still spin this in our favor." Mateo's response was a low, frustrated rumble. "We're running out of time. If the board initiates a full investigation, we're finished. We need another way to move the funds. Quietly. And fast." Brian exchanged a quick glance with Grace. His heart pounded as her eyes widened, reflecting the same realization. This was the evidence they needed, proof that Mateo was still plotting to embezzle the hotel's money, even after the accounts had been frozen. "We'll need to move carefully," Judy said, her tone measured. "The staff is starting to sense something's wrong. If they turn against us—" "They won't," Mateo cut in sharply. His voice carried a steely edge, laced with menace. "I'll make sure they don't." Brian felt a wave of unease churn in his stomach at Mateo's chilling confidence. The man wasn't just desperate, he was dangerous. He wasn't backing down. If anything, Mateo was digging in deeper, intent on finding a way to outmaneuver the board and anyone else standing in his way. Brian tightened his jaw, determination flaring to life. They were closer than ever to exposing Mateo, but the fight was far from over. The man was relentless, doubling down on his threats as he sought to keep the staff in line through fear and manipulation. Brian Henry felt a surge of anger well up inside him as he listened to the icy precision in Mateo's voice. There was no hint of remorse, no flicker of hesitation. Mateo was a man willing to raise everything and everyone in his way to achieve his goals. "Brian Henry is the real issue," Mateo continued, his voice a low, menacing growl. "He's been meddling from the start, and now the board is actually paying attention to him. We need to neutralize him before he does any more damage." A chill shot down Brian's spine. Mateo's words carried a venomous edge, leaving no doubt about his intentions. Neutralize him. Brian knew exactly what that meant. Mateo would stop at nothing to silence him for good. "We'll handle Henry," Judy said, her tone steady and void of emotion. "I'll make sure he doesn't interfere again." Brian's heart pounded in his chest. Every word he heard deepened his resolve. Mateo wasn't just a corrupt leader, he was a danger to everyone who stood in his way. He exchanged a quick, determined glance with Grace. They had heard more than enough. With a subtle nod, Brian signaled her to stop the recording. Grace pressed the button on the voice recorder, her hands trembling slightly as she secured the evidence. Then she pointed a tiny finger and said, "Start now." They had it, the proof they needed. Mateo's scheme to siphon off the hotel's funds, his threats against the staff, and his personal vendetta against Brian were all on tape. Now, their mission was clear. Get this evidence to Marvin and the board before Mateo made his next move. Brian and Grace moved swiftly, slipping back toward the service elevator. The hallway seemed even quieter now, as though the weight of what they had just uncovered stilled the air around them. Every step they took was measured, cautious, as if Mateo or Judy might appear at any moment to stop them. Inside the elevator, the soft hum of the machinery was the only sound, underscoring the tension that hung between them. Grace clutched the voice recorder tightly, her knuckles white. Brian's thoughts raced, replaying the conversation they had just captured. Mateo's cold determination, his brazen threats. It was all still echoing in his mind, fueling his determination. "We did it," Grace whispered, her voice tinged with both relief and urgency. "We have what we need." Brian nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "We're not done yet," he said, his tone resolute. "We still have to get this to Marvin. If Mateo finds out what we've done before we get to the board—" He didn't finish the thought, but Grace understood. One slip, one mistake, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. Mateo wouldn't hesitate to destroy them if he suspected they were behind his unraveling. As the elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, Brian stepped out first, scanning the area. The lobby was quieter than usual, the late hour leaving it almost deserted. But Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They needed to move quickly. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm but quiet. Together, they made their way toward the exit, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had the truth. Now, they just had to make sure it saw the light of day. The elevator doors parted, revealing the dimly lit corridor of the Henry Plaza Hotel's lower level. Brian Henry stepped out cautiously, his steps quiet against the soft carpet. The hallway was eerily still, the late hour ensuring most of the staff were either gone or occupied with night shift duties. Beside him, Grace clutched the voice recorder tightly, her knuckles white with tension. They exchanged a brief, resolute glance. "We have to get this to Marvin," Brian murmured, his voice barely audible. "If we move fast, the board can hear the recording first thing in the morning." Grace nodded, her face a mask of determination, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "What about Mateo? He's going to notice something's off when we don't show up for our shifts tomorrow." Brian exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Mateo would figure it out. There was no escaping that reality. But by the time the man realized what was happening, Brian hoped it would be too late for him to act. "We'll be gone before he knows what's happening," Brian replied, though the anxiety coiling in his chest made his voice falter slightly. "If we can get this to the board before he gets wind of it, there's nothing he can do." They slipped out of the hotel through a side exit, the brisk night air hitting them like a jolt of clarity. The city stretched out before them, its distant hum of activity punctuated by the occasional car passing down a nearby street. But Brian barely noticed the sounds of the city around him. His focus was entirely on the task at hand. Every step they took away from the Henry Plaza felt like both progress and peril, as if each move brought them closer to exposing Mateo, but also closer to being caught. Brian pulled out his phone, quickly typing a message to Marvin. "We have the evidence. We need to meet now. It can't wait until morning." They stood in the shadows of a street corner, the faint orange glow of a streetlight illuminating their anxious faces. The seconds stretched painfully as they waited, the silence between them filled with unspoken worries. Then Brian's phone buzzed, the vibration cutting through the tension like a lifeline. "Meet me at my apartment. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Brian exhaled, relief washing over him for a brief moment, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. The plan wasn't finished yet. They still had to reach Marvin safely. "Let's go," Brian said firmly, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. He led Grace down the dimly lit street, scanning the area for a cab. Every moment spent in the open felt like an invitation for disaster, but they had no choice. Grace followed closely, her grip on the recorder unrelenting. Neither spoke as they walked, their thoughts consumed by the magnitude of what they had just done. Mateo's cold threats still echoed in Brian's mind, a stark reminder of the stakes. They flagged down a cab and climbed in quickly, giving the driver Marvin's address. As the car pulled away from the curb, Brian cast one last glance at the hotel, its towering silhouette looming against the night sky. The Henry Plaza had been his father's pride, a symbol of hospitality and integrity. He wouldn't let Mateo destroy it, not without a fight. The cab sped through the quiet streets, carrying them toward what Brian hoped would be their final stand against the corruption that had nearly consumed everything his family had worked to build. The drive to Marvin's apartment felt excruciatingly slow, each minute dragging like an hour. Though it was just a short trip across town, the tension in the air made every passing second unbearable. Brian Henry stared out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of memories and possibilities. His arrival at the Henry Plaza Hotel had been under the guise of uncovering Mateo's corruption, and now they stood on the brink of exposing the truth. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous moments were still ahead. Beside him, Grace sat silently, gripping the recorder tightly in her hands. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed on the illuminated streets rushing by. The gravity of their mission weighed heavily on them both, robbing them of words. When the cab finally pulled up outside Marvin's apartment building, Brian quickly handed cash to the driver and stepped out into the cool night air. The faint hum of the city buzzed in the background, a stark contrast to the pounding of his heart. He scanned the quiet street cautiously, then motioned for Grace to follow him toward the entrance. Inside, the staircase was dimly lit, their hurried footsteps echoing against the narrow walls as they ascended. Reaching Marvin's door, Brian knocked softly but firmly. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Marvin with a grave expression etched across his face. Concern and urgency flickered in his eyes as he stepped aside. "Come in," Marvin said, his voice low. Brian and Grace entered the modest apartment, its quiet atmosphere offering a brief but fragile sense of safety. Without wasting a second, Brian placed the voice recorder on the small wooden table in the center of the room. His voice was steady but strained as he explained what they had overheard in Mateo's office. Each word painted a darker picture, and with every detail, Marvin's expression grew more somber. When Brian finished, Marvin leaned back in his chair, his face a mix of determination and grim realization. "This is worse than I imagined," Marvin said, his tone heavy. "But this evidence changes everything. The board won't be able to ignore this. Mateo has no way out now." Brian nodded, though the tightness in his chest remained. Mateo's not the kind to surrender quietly. He's going to retaliate, and when he does, it won't be subtle. We need to prepare for that. Marvin met Brian's gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever he tries, we'll make sure it ends here." Grace, still gripping the recorder, glanced between the two men. "We need to act quickly. The longer this drags on, the more time he has to plot his next move." Marvin nodded, his voice firm as he spoke. "First thing in the morning, I'll call an emergency board meeting. We'll present this evidence, freeze his influence, and take him down for good." Brian exchanged a glance with Grace, their shared determination palpable. They had come too far to let fear or hesitation stop them now. The battle wasn't over, but with Marvin's help and the damning evidence in hand, they were ready to face whatever came next. As they stepped into Marvin's apartment, he motioned toward the chairs around a modest wooden table. Brian Henry handed over the voice recorder without hesitation, his movements deliberate yet filled with tension. "We've recorded Mateo," Brian said firmly, his tone steady even as the weight of the situation pressed on him. "He's still planning to move the funds, despite the accounts being frozen. He's threatening the staff, manipulating them, This recorder has everything you need to take him down." Marvin accepted the device, his expression grim as he listened to Brian's explanation. He said nothing at first, letting Brian's words hang heavy in the room. With a slow, deliberate motion, Marvin pressed play. The room was soon filled with Mateo's voice, a cold, calculating tone detailing his plans to siphon money, his sharp threats against the employees, and his callous indifference toward the chaos he'd created. Each word brought the grim reality of his intentions into sharper focus. This was the proof they had been hoping to find, but hearing it aloud made the stakes feel even higher. When the recording ended, Marvin leaned back in his chair, his face set in a mask of deep thought. The room fell silent, the weight of what they had just heard lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. "This is devastating," Marvin said finally, his voice low and measured. "There's no way Mateo can spin this. The board won't have a choice. They'll have to act." Brian nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. "We need to call an emergency board meeting. As soon as they hear this, Mateo's control will be over." Marvin looked at Brian, his gaze steady and resolute. "I'll make the call first thing tomorrow morning. The meeting will happen and Mateo won't be able to stop it." Relief swept over Brian, but it was fleeting. Mateo wasn't the type to back down quietly. Once he discovered what had happened, Brian knew things could spiral out of control quickly. "What about tomorrow?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with unease. "Mateo will know something's wrong when Brian doesn't show up at the hotel. He might try to block the meeting." Marvin's jaw tightened, his determination evident. "I'll handle it. The meeting will happen before Mateo can make his move. We'll be prepared for whatever he tries." Brian gave a small nod, though the tension in his chest refused to fade. He trusted Marvin to do everything in his power, but Mateo had spent years weaving his web of control. He was a master manipulator, skilled at intimidation and deceit, and he wouldn't let his empire crumble without a fight. Yet, as Brian looked at the voice recorder on the table, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had something powerful now. The truth. And the truth, when wielded carefully, had the power to dismantle even the most fortified lies. The following morning, Brian Henry awoke with a start, the adrenaline from the previous night's events still coursing through him. Today was the day it would all come to a head, the day Mateo would finally face the repercussions of his actions. Brian and Grace had spent the night in a modest hotel room on the other side of town, far from Henry Plaza and beyond Mateo's grasp. They knew it was too risky to stay anywhere near the hotel until the board meeting was over and the situation had been resolved. Sitting in the cramped room, Brian felt the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The battle wasn't over yet. Even with the damning recording, there were so many unknowns: Mateo's mysterious partner, Judy's deeper involvement, and the full scope of Mateo's plans. Still, the most critical step had been taken. They had the evidence that could expose him. Grace paced the small room, her nervous energy palpable, her brow furrowed, and she glanced at Brian with apprehension. "Do you really think this will work? Do you think the board will take the recording seriously?" "They have to," Brian replied, his voice steady, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "The recording speaks for itself. They can't ignore what's on it." Grace nodded, though her worry lingered. "But Mateo, he's been manipulating them for years. What if he manages to twist this? What if he turns it all back on us?" Brian met her gaze, forcing himself to project confidence. "He can't. The evidence is too clear. Once the board hears that recording, they won't be able to look the other way." Still, even as he spoke, Brian couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Mateo was desperate now, and desperation made people dangerous. A sudden vibration from his phone broke the tension in the room. Brian grabbed it from the nightstand and read the message from Marvin. "The board is meeting now. I'll call you as soon as it's over." Brian exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. His chest felt heavy with anticipation, The waiting was excruciating. Everything they had fought for hinged on that meeting, on the board's decision and their willingness to act on the truth. Grace sat down beside him, her leg bouncing with nervous energy. "I can't believe we're finally here," she murmured, "after everything we've been through, after all those nights wondering if we were doing the right thing." Brian nodded, his thoughts racing as memories of the past few months flooded his mind. The weeks of working undercover, the constant tension of hiding their intentions, the sleepless nights worrying about what Matteo might do if he found out. It had all led to this moment. Now they were so close to achieving justice, yet the uncertainty was unbearable. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Brian and Grace exchanged hopeful yet anxious glances. The room felt stifling, the weight of their decisions heavy in the air. Both of them knew that once the board made their decision, nothing would ever be the same again, for better or for worse. 2 hours later, Brian Henry's phone buzzed, shattering the tense silence of the room. He answered immediately, his heart pounding, as Marvin's steady voice greeted him on the other end. "It's done," Marvin said, his tone measured but carrying a weight of urgency. "The board voted unanimously. Matteo has been removed from his position, effective immediately. He's out." Relief surged through Brian like a tidal wave, his shoulders sagging as the tension of the past days momentarily lifted. But Marvin's tone carried a cautious undertone that made Brian's stomach tighten. "What about Matteo?" Brian asked, his voice tinged with unease. There was a pause, the kind that stretched longer than it should have. When Marvin spoke again, his voice had dropped, as if reluctant to deliver the news. "He knows. He left the hotel a little while ago. But Brian, listen to me. He didn't look like someone who's accepting defeat. Be careful." The relief that had barely begun to settle in Brian's chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Matteo was out, yes, but the man wasn't finished. Marvin's warning echoed in his mind, each word laced with foreboding. Brian lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen as his mind raced. Matteo had been removed from power, but the fight was far from over. He could feel it in the air, a tension that refused to break. Matteo wasn't the type to walk away quietly. This wasn't just a defeat to him. It was a challenge, one he wasn't willing to lose. Grace's voice broke the silence, pulling him from his thoughts. "What did he say?" she asked, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. Brian exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. "Matteo's out. The board voted him out, effective immediately." Grace's shoulders sagged in relief for a brief moment, but her eyes remained locked on his, sensing there was more. But, he knows," Brian said, his voice low. "And Marvin thinks he's not giving up. He's left the hotel, but this isn't over."